Hey, welcome everybody. I'm glad you are joining us here for part one of Life Together in a World Apart. This is our book group together where we're going to be studying Dietrich Bonhoeffer's text, Life Together. And just so you know, this video, we're going to have one of these videos come out. We're going to have three of these total. It's going to be me sort of talking a little bit about the chapter, a little bit of Bonhoeffer's history, and maybe providing some questions for you to sort of think about as you read the text. And then we're going to have the following week, after one of these come out, we're going to have a Zoom discussion together where we will sort of be able to come together to talk about the book, bring your questions, your comments, your favorite parts, all of that kind of thing. And then all throughout the study, we're going to have our discussions on our Facebook page. So I hope you will join that if you haven't already. If you need help getting on there, you can email me at chazsnyder@calvarymoravian.org, and I can help you out with that, or message me on Facebook. That's totally fine too. So I want to do a few things here in our first time together. I want to talk a little bit about some more about the format of the course. So we'll talk a little bit about how this is going to go, how this sort of book study is going to go together, and the first thing I want to sort of get off right off the bat is please be in contact with me as much as you can about what's working, what's not working. This is a first time for me doing something like this. This is the first time for us at Calvary doing something like this. So all the feedback would be wonderful. My goal is that we have really good interactions with one another, really good conversation that's facilitated during this time where we couldn't be doing a book study down at a coffee shop or here at the church or something like that. So we want to kind of create that same experience, but trying to do so in this sort of online format. So hopefully you'll get some good information about the book, and I hope you'll enjoy the book. But most of all, I want you to feel like you can have a really good conversation about the book and feel like you can sort of share your thoughts. So if there's things that I can do to make that easier while we're doing this, please email me, let me know. So first, again, a little bit about the format. So these are going to come out these videos will come out on the Monday or Tuesday of the weeks where we have one of these sort of content videos. And then the following week, we're going to do a Zoom discussion group on Thursdays at 6:30 p.m. So that's going to be Thursday the 15th of October, Thursday the 29th of October, and Thursday the 9th of October will be our discussion times. All of those at 6:30. I will send out the Zoom information in the next update. I'll put it on the Facebook page. I'll put it in an email to everybody. I know it's kind of hard to pick like one time where we can all sort of come together. So what we're going to do is sort of stick with this one. If it doesn't work for you, email me or Facebook message me and give me some alternative times that do work. And we can, if we need to facilitate a second Zoom discussion, if there's like afternoons work better for some people, or that way we'll have we'll have a time on the books, and we can set a separate time or another time, or even change it if enough people. So just like I said, email me if that time doesn't work. Thursdays at 6:30, and that'll be the 15th of October, the 29th of October, and then the 9th of November will be our three Zoom discussions. And then on the alternate weeks, you'll get a video like this where I'll talk. My goal is to talk a little bit about the book, also to give some more information on Bonhoeffer's life is part of what I want to do in these videos, so that you can maybe help get a little bit better context of sort of what Bonhoeffer's doing, and sort of where he's coming from, because I think that really helps understand sort of how sort of some of the things in this book. Excuse me while I'm drinking some water. So hopefully you all have your copy of the book. It is, again, this is the copy that we're using for this study. If you have an older version, I've got a couple versions. This is one. These are the same translations, but different. And then there's a few older ones. You can use whichever one you want. If you want to just know where I'm referencing, just make sure. I'll be using the page numbers from this one. This is the Life Together from the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Works Reader's Edition. And this is the most recent translation from German of his text. And it was, so it's newer, and they've sort of worked on making the English a little bit more fit a little bit better than some of the older translations. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. For this session, we're going to be looking at the first two chapters. Chapter 1, which is on community, and then chapter 2, which is on the day alone, is what those are called. But before we really get into the nitty-gritty of the two chapters, I want to talk a little bit about Bonhoeffer's life, mostly pertaining to when he's writing this book, Life Together. So a general biography, if you're interested in wanting to know more, I brought a couple things to show you. My favorite biography for Bonhoeffer is this one, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, A Biography by Eberhard Bethge. This was Bonhoeffer's best friend. It is kind of thick. There's another really thick biography by somebody that got pretty famous. I would definitely suggest this one over that one. This is much more accurate. It's much more detailed. And so, yeah, if you want a biography, a good biography, even if you don't read the whole thing, this is the one I would definitely suggest. If you want something else, if you want to know a little bit more once you've gotten into this book, I really suggest this one too. This is called A Testament to Freedom. It is a collection of Bonhoeffer's writings, so from all across. It's sort of his greatest hits, but each one of his writings has an introduction, and it gives some biography in those introductions. So it's a really great sort of, if you want to go deeper after you read this book. And so I wanted to bring those two sort of suggestions for you, for those who might want to dig a little bit deeper. So Bonhoeffer, he was a German Lutheran pastor, born into sort of a middle class family. He was the only one in his family to sort of go and off to study theology and to go into being a Lutheran minister. And some interesting things. We won't go into a whole lot of this, but there's a lot of really interesting Moravian connections between Bonhoeffer and the Moravians. He was a big fan of the daily text. You'll find in a lot of his writings he references the daily text, and I think even we'll find references in here to this book, to the daily text, and I'll try to point some of those out as we go. Bonhoeffer would have been familiar with some Moravian practices and customs, and he definitely, in different ones of his writings, sort of shows some appreciation towards Moravians. So there's some interesting connections there. Once he became a minister, he served congregations in Spain. He served congregations in England, as well as congregations in Germany, I believe. That might not be right. But he did go on to sort of become a professor. So he did two doctoral dissertations, and one of those was on the Christian community. That was his first one. And you'll see a lot of those ideas expressed in this book, because this book is all about community. So where Bonhoeffer's life begins to get really interesting is when the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany and the rise of fascism in Germany. So he was from early on resisted fascism and Nazism in Germany. He resisted sort of the way that the Nazi Party began to sort of take over the German church at that time, and was very, very early critic of all of this. He had a radio broadcast where he was denouncing sort of fascism and the treatment of the Jews early on, and it was actually cut off. It was cut off mid-broadcast. He eventually sort of left the German state church and became part of what was the Confessing Church, which was sort of a sort of a resistance church against the sort of state church of Germany. And actually, where it becomes really important to this book is this book was written while he was at basically sort of an underground alternative seminary that was sort of started in resistance to the German state church and Nazism, and meant to push back against that. So this text, Life Together, is basically like a how we lived in community together at this seminary in Finkenwald, Germany. And so you'll see that as we get through this book. That's what's grounding this. This is coming out of very practical sort of reading and understanding of how they did their life together, how they lived in community with one another, how they would study together, pray together, confess together, take the Lord's Supper together. And so you'll begin to see some of those themes you'll begin to see some of those themes pretty early on in this book. You'll see it goes through sort of the social rhythms, the spiritual practices, the disciplines that they sort of practiced together. So it wasn't just a seminary for sort of educating your mind, but it's also was all about practice too, which is a very important thing for Bonhoeffer. Was really Christianity is not just something. Faith is not just something that is an intellectual exercise. It is something that must be practiced and put into practice. And so, Bonhoeffer's resistance to Nazism continued. Eventually, he had to. That seminary was shut down, and he had to. He went to England for a bit, then to America. Taught at Union Seminary, or for a little bit, or was around Union Seminary in New York. Was very influenced by the Black Church in America, and there's some writings where he compares the racism in the United States towards African Americans to the way that the Germans treated the Jews in Germany. He draws some pretty stark comparisons that I think are really important for us to reflect on in sort of our society. But there was a moment where he could have stayed. He had the ability to stay in the States and not go back to Germany, but he actually took the last sort of public, or the last sort of private citizen boat that left America to go to Germany, back to Germany, and he went back and worked for it was basically a civilian intelligence agency in Germany, and he eventually was arrested for passing papers in a plot to kill Hitler, and an assassination attempt on Hitler. He was put in Tegel prison, which is outside of Berlin, and there he wrote a lot of letters. There's a collection of those called Letters and Papers from Prison, which is sort of some of the last stuff we have of his writings that are very, very interesting, and very, very prophetic for sort of where Christianity would go sort of into the future, into the rest of the 20th century. And so there's some really interesting stuff in those. Eventually, during the last sort of phases, as Germany was sort of losing the war, they transferred him and some other members of his family to a concentration camp, and he was hung at that concentration camp and executed only just I think a few days before that camp was liberated. And his writings have influenced many different people from many different theological backgrounds. So he's used, a lot of people reference him, and definitely was has been a major influence in my thinking. I really enjoy his writings and think that he still has a lot to say. And this was the first book that I read by Bonhoeffer, and this is the first one that really sparked my interest. So that's a little bit of a very quick biography of Bonhoeffer. So what I hope to do is throughout this is when we have one of these sort of videos, I'll maybe give some more details of his biography that I think might be helpful to sort of what we're reading. But I want to take the last couple minutes of this time together and just talk through a little bit about the book in general, sort of why we chose it to do a book study now in the midst of sort of the COVID pandemic and our isolation, and then a bit about the first two chapters. So let's just talk a little bit about the book in general. So, like I mentioned earlier, this book was written during his time at the Finkenwald Seminary, sort of leading seminary students, and they lived in a communal house together, and this was sort of their way of resisting sort of what was going on, their way of forming an alternative community to what they saw as the church that was being corrupted by the Nazi Party. And it's important to realize that this is much more than sort of like a naive optimism for Bonhoeffer. This isn't just sort of like we just need to isolate ourselves and create this sort of utopian community and not really engage the world. But this was a way to actively resist sort of what he saw as a corrupting force in the church, and the way the church itself actually made decisions to sort of back some of the fascist parts of the government. And So these were written in 1938. These were reflections on how he understood Christian community, and based on their common life together, what they did. That's where the name of the book comes from. And this was the stimulus for writing this text was that this seminary was closed, that it was closed down by the Nazis, and so he wrote this as a way of sort of documenting what that was, and he wanted this to have a bigger impact than just here's a record of what we did at this seminary, but as a way to sort of speak to there's something core about Christian community. There's some core aspects that form what it means to be in community together, and how that relates to the mission of the church and how that relates to the purpose of the church. So this comes from the introduction of this edition. I'm going to read a quote here, and I definitely suggest you read the introduction. I think it's quite good. It gives a very good overview, and it's not too long, so it gives a really good overview. I also want to point out we will be referencing these not so much today, but at some point maybe in our Zoom discussions more. On page 99 at the back of this text, there are some study questions. So I really encourage you to kind of take a look at those and look through those as a way to sort of like really get your sort of thoughts going and things like that. So yeah, let's just dive right in. This is from the introduction. It says. This is him sort of describing the book. He says, "The will of God is expressed in the words spoken to the human being and their community in their communities of faith." Basically, I take that to mean that what Bonhoeffer is doing here is showing how fundamental we need other Christians. That we need other Christians to be Christ for us and with us when we need the strength and the bond of other Christians, that Christianity is not an individualist enterprise. It is a communal thing. And then he goes on in the introduction to say, life together deals with the nature of this Christ-centered community, which that will come up a lot, Christ-centered community. The life of Christians living together, united in service to and for one another through prayer, the practice of confession, and the partaking of the Lord's Supper. So right off the bat, you see that there's not just how we understand God, but it's how we put that faith into practice. And maybe we can talk more about that in our Zoom discussion together, what that looks like now. And I think that's the reason why we chose this to sort of look at for our time together during this life together in a world apart. Because this text really gets at some core ideas of what it means to be Christian community, which we're wrestling with those right now. We're wrestling with what does it mean to be a church when we can't gather on Sundays, or it's all online, or we're seeing each other from a distance, or we have masks on when we talk to each other. So some of the really basic parts of community have changed drastically for us in a very short amount of time. And the reason for getting into this book is to really allow us a way to talk about and to reflect on what are the core aspects. Because one of the things that Bonhoeffer really picks up on throughout his writings is that the way we relate to God changes through time, through different culture. There is how the church is formed will shift and change, because he watched what was in his mind the church sort of give itself over to one of the most destructive governments and empires in modern history. And so there was no commitment to the church as an institution. There was a commitment to the church as an idea, as something to be lived out, not something to be organized. And so that was really important for him. And so we'll see that it's in these practices that we find the Christian community. It's in these practices. It's what we commit to one another. It's what we believe about the Holy Spirit and Christ's Spirit being among us. And so yeah, that's sort of like why we're looking at doing this during this time, is because I think a lot of these things are very, very relevant. So sort of what we're dealing with. So I want to pull two quick quotes just to kind of go over the sections really quick, and then I want to leave you with some questions that I'd love for you to respond to in the chat of the Facebook page. You can email me your responses, write them down, save them for the Zoom discussion. But I want to leave you with some questions to think about to sort of prompt your own thinking. So, in the first chapter is called Community, and what you'll find in this section, and this is one of my favorite sections of the book. I'm trying to find my. Oh, here it is. So this is my first the first copy of the book that I read a few years ago, and I wanted to show you that I highlighted this section. It looks like a rainbow because the highlights almost became pointless because I pretty much highlighted the entire first chapter. It's one of my favorite. This chapter is one of my favorite pieces of theological writing out there. And what we'll see is that the key thing here is he talks about the love that binds Christians together. This is from this is from the community section of the introduction. They say love was the binding force in the Christian community. Criticizing purely emotional love, that's what you'll see Bonhoeffer sort of critiquing, which when unexamined violated the call of Christ to an agapic love that was without present conditions. So basically sort of talking about that there is this emotional love that sort of like that can change based on how we're feeling, on what is on a whim, on our emotions that can fluctuate. But Bonhoeffer's getting at this Christian agape love that sort of transcends that isn't bound to sort of how we're feeling. Unlike calculating, manipulating, self-serving emotional love, the spiritual love Bonhoeffer advocated was deferential, humble, and unconditional. And so he's really trying to unpack what is this meaning of love that is at the core of Christian community. And I think this is a really important place for us to start. And what we'll probably spend some time talking about in our first discussion is what does this love look like, and what are some aspects of it. So you'll see a lot of that in that first community and on the first chapter on community, and then you'll see in the second chapter, the day together. This is basically where he emphasizes the need for a daily structure. He emphasizes a need for organizing your day, and this doesn't have to mean like, set your alarm for 6:30, do your hour and a half devotionals, or it looks different for everybody and each one of us in different times. But I think what is important, what Bonhoeffer is getting at, which I think is important for us to think about, is the idea of intentionality, of thinking through what we do, thinking through how we spend our time, thinking through what brings value, and what things are worth sort of working towards. And so you'll see that's sort of where we'll see in this chapter 2, the day alone. So what is it like having what does it mean to have an internal life? And so we'll talk more about that too in our Zoom discussion. But those are the two main themes you'll see. I want to leave you with these 3 questions. And again, I want you to take these questions, respond to them in the Facebook group. If you're not on Facebook, that's where I would really like us to sort of do most of our conversation between sessions. But if you're not on Facebook or you'd prefer to sort of save it for the Zoom discussion, just write it down, make sure or have it ready to talk about. So the first question is, what stands out to you about how Bonhoeffer understands community? What stands out to you about how Bonhoeffer understands community? So I want you to sort of think through, like, what did you find unique about what he had to say? What did you maybe an aspect of community that you didn't know or you didn't think was important that he sort of emphasized, or maybe where you disagree with him, where you don't think that what he's emphasizing is part of Christian community. So that's question number 1. Question number 2 is, how do you apply Bonhoeffer's teaching on the day together? And so that's really sort of looking at chapter 2, where he's sort of talking about the day together, and what does that look like in light of COVID-19? Like, what does that look like in light of our world where we aren't together? We're not waking up and sort of like, having daily devotions as a group or morning prayer time. Like even before COVID, this wasn't like normal practice. We lived pretty isolated lives for the most part. But this sort of our current state has called that into question even more. So what are some, how do you think we can apply this teaching that Bonhoeffer gives us on the day together in light of where we're at now? So that's question number 2. And the final thing that I want you to do is to just pull your favorite quote from these 2 chapters, maybe even from the introduction if there's something there that really stood out to you. But just pull your favorite quote and then post that on the Facebook group, or shoot me an email with it, or have it ready for discussion when we Zoom together. Just because I think there's a lot of good quotes in here, and I'd love to know what everyone's thinking and what everyone sees as their favorite parts of this. So yeah, those are the 3 questions. Obviously, you can go back, click back on this video, rewatch it, listen to them again. But yeah. Love to get some stuff going on the Facebook page. I will post this video there. There'll also be a YouTube link to this video in an email, in addition to the Zoom information. Again, our next Zoom chat is going to be next Thursday, the 15th of October at 6:30 p.m. And if that doesn't work for you, send me an alternative time, and we'll get something scheduled that will work. So I hope you enjoy this format. Hope I didn't go too long. And I can't wait for us to sort of meet virtually together in our first Zoom chat together. So grace and peace, everybody.